I departed feeling despondent, isolated from most of my peers. Stanley Cohen and Herb Boyer found the occasion disheartening as well. They believed, as I did, that many of our colleagues had compromised their better judgment as scientists just to be seen by the assembled press as good guys, and not as potential Dr. Frankensteins. In fact, the vast majority had never worked with disease-causing organisms and little understood the implications of the research restrictions they wanted to impose on those of us who did. I was irked by the arbitrariness of much of what had been agreed. DNA from cold-blooded vertebrates was, for instance, deemed acceptable, while mammalian DNA was ruled off limits for most scientists. Apparently it was safe to work with DNA from a toad, but not with DNA from a mouse. Well, dumbstruck by such nonsense, I offered up a bit of my own. Didn't everyone know that toads cause warts? But my facetious objections were in vain. The guidelines led many participants in the Asilomar conference to expect clear sailing for research based on cloning in safe bacteria. But anyone who set off under such an impression very soon hit choppy seas. According to the logic peddled by the popular press, if scientists themselves saw cause for concern, well, then the public at large should really be alarmed. These were, after all, still the days, though waning, of the American counterculture. Both the Vietnam War and Richard Nixon's political career had only recently petered out. A suspicious public, ill-equipped to understand complexities that science itself was only beginning to fathom, was only too eager to swallow theories of evil conspiracies perpetrated by the establishment. For our part, we scientists were quite surprised to see ourselves counted among this elite, to which we had never before imagined we belonged. Even Herb Boyer, the veritable model of a hippie scientist, would find himself named in a special Halloween issue of the Berkeley Barb, the Bay Area's underground paper, as one of the region's 10 biggest bogeymen, a distinction otherwise reserved for corrupt Pauls and union-busting capitalists. My greatest fear was that this blooming public paranoia about molecular biology would result in draconian legislation. Having experimental do's and don'ts laid down for us in some cumbersome legalese could only be bad for science. Plans for experiments would have to be submitted to politically minded review panels, and the whole hopeless bureaucracy that comes with this kind of territory would take hold like the moths in grandmother's closet. Meanwhile, our best attempts to assess the real risk potential of our work continued to be dogged by a complete lack of data and by the logical difficulty of proving a negative. No recombinant DNA catastrophe had ever occurred, but the press continued to outdo itself, imagining worst-case scenarios. In his account of a meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1977, the biochemist Leon Heppel aptly summed up the absurdities scientists perceived in the controversy. I felt the way I would feel if I had been selected for an ad hoc committee convened by the Spanish government to try to evaluate the risks assumed by Christopher Columbus and his sailors. A committee that was supposed to set up guidelines for what to do in case the Earth was flat, how far the crew might safely venture to the Earth's edge, etc. Even withering irony, however, could little hinder those hell-bent on countering what they saw as science's Promethean hubris. One such crusader was Alfred Vellucci, the mayor of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Vellucci had earned his political chops championing the common man at the expense of his town's elite institutions of learning, namely MIT and Harvard. The recombinant DNA tempest provided him with a political bonanza. A contemporary account captures nicely what was going on. In his cranberry double-knit jacket and black pants, with his yellow-striped blue shirt struggling to contain a beer belly, right down to his crooked teeth and overstuffed pockets, Al Vellucci is the incarnation of middle American frustration at these scientists, these technocrats, these smart-ass Harvard eggheads who think they've got the world by a string and wind up dropping it in a puddle of mud. And who winds up in the puddle? Not the eggheads. No, it's always Al Vellucci and the ordinary working people who are left alone to wipe themselves off. Whence this heat? Scientists at Harvard had voiced a desire to build an on-campus containment facility for doing recombinant work in strict accordance with the new NIH guidelines. But seeing his chance, and backed by a left-wing Harvard-MIT cabal with its own anti-DNA agenda, Vellucci managed to push through a several-month ban on all recombinant DNA research in Cambridge. The result was a brief but pronounced local brain drain, as Harvard and MIT biologists headed off to less politically charged climes. Vellucci, meanwhile, began to enjoy his newfound prominence as society's scientific watchdog. In 1977, he would write to the president of the National Academy of Sciences. In today's edition of the Boston Herald-American, a Hearst publication, there are two reports which concern me greatly. In Dover, Mass., a strange orange-eyed creature was sighted, and in Hollis, New Hampshire, a man and his two sons were confronted by a hairy 9-foot creature. I would respectfully ask that your prestigious institution investigate these findings. I would hope as well that you might check to see whether or not these strange creatures, should they in fact exist, are in any way connected to recombinant DNA experiments taking place in the New England area. Though much debated, attempts to enact national legislation regulating recombinant DNA experiments, fortunately, never came to fruition. Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts entered the fray early on, holding a Senate hearing just a month after Asilomar. In 1976, he wrote President Ford to advise that the federal government should control industrial as well as academic DNA research. In March of '77, I testified before a hearing of the California State Legislature. Governor Jerry Brown was in attendance, and so I had the occasion to advise him in person that it would be a mistake to consider any legislative action except in the event of unexplained illnesses among the scientists at Stanford. If those actually handling recombinant DNA remained perfectly healthy, the public would be better served if lawmakers focused on more evident dangers to public health, like bike riding. As more and more experiments were performed, whether under NIH guidelines or under those imposed by regulators in other countries, it became more and more apparent that recombinant DNA procedures were not creating Frankenbugs, much less, pace Mr. Vellucci, strange